Perfect. Well, hey, thank you again for the invitation to be a guest host. I'm really excited, and I'm really glad that I got the choice of papers, and this is really, really great. So what we have here today is climate variability and breeding parameters of a transhemispheric migratory seabird. That is a lot of words, over 7 decades. First, I have to say, I really enjoyed reading this paper. I feel like it was just really fun to read, and it was very straightforwardly written, so thank you for that. Because a lot of, I like to think about things at larger spatial scales, and so this, I was definitely very much drawn to this, and obviously I love seabirds. And so the other thing I want to say that I really appreciate about it is it's seabirds, and it's a long-term data set, which is absolutely incredible. And so let's get into it. I'm going to give a real brief summary. So certainly there's going to be a few things that I might miss. But then if it's okay, is it Cassandra, or do you prefer to be called Cassandra?
Oh, Cass.
Cass, okay. I'd like to just ask you a couple of questions and then maybe open it up for questions with everyone else. Does that sound like an okay plan?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. And also, if I get anything wrong, please do correct me. I certainly don't want to get anything wrong. So, so this is a study that looked at banded birds over a 62-year period. These are short-tailed shearwaters. Am I guessing? Yeah, short-tailed shearwaters on Fisher Island in Australia. So banded birds over 62 years. And what you guys did was looking at the breeding success and the number of breeders, and looking at whether climate variability had an impact on those parameters. And some of the key findings were that there were about 198 or so breeding pairs per year on average. The range, I thought, of breeding pairs was pretty interesting. It ranged from 58 breeding pairs in 1971 to 160 breeding pairs in 2007. So that's kind of one of my questions I want to ask you about. And breeding success seemed to range pretty widely as well, with less than 1% in 2004 and 2006, and 92% in 1961, which is pretty wonderful. And then overarching, looking at the climate variability and what factors are influencing short-tailed shearwaters. It seems as though, first of all, I should back up and say what the climate variability was. You guys looked at the Pacific Decadal Oscillation and the North Pacific Index in the Northern Hemisphere, and the Southern Annular Mode and the El Nino Southern Oscillation in the Southern Hemisphere. Now keep in mind that these are, I learned a lot by reading this, by the way. These are birds that migrate from Australia all the way to the Aleutian Islands and back, so hence the transhemispheric nature of their biology. The Southern Annular Mode during November and December from the previous year explained the most variation. So this was the early breeding period for the birds. An increase in the Southern Annular Mode increased the number of birds that were coming back to Fisher Island. The Southern Oscillation during the chick rearing, why do I have this written down? The Southern Oscillation during the chick rearing period from the previous year was also positively correlated. And interestingly, and perhaps not super surprising, is that high rainfall also had an impact on the breeding success. So more rain, less breeding success. That was a very rough overview of what you guys were able to look at. The thing I love about this is a long time period. So I have a couple different questions, and I'm just wondering, Cass, if you would be able to describe a little bit and break down some of the what this means. So the Southern Annular Mode having an impact on the number of birds. Why is that? Can you like explain it to me like I'm 5? What does that mean, and why is that happening?
I might hand that over to Eric. I'm just feeling a bit flustered. I'm just got to open my toilet. Sorry. I'm sorry, I'm burning up.
Oh, sorry, Eric. I'm trying to unmute
Sorry,
you.
Heat just came down for him.
Here you go, Eric. You're open too.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay,
Sorry.
so no, that's okay. So the one thing that I was trying to kind of put together, and I was reading my notes obviously as I was giving this, you know, kind of just overviewing what you guys were able to do, and I'm still for me, looking at like the climate variability, looking at the southern annular mode and ENSO is such a big thing. Like literally, it's huge. What does that mean? Is if there's a, you know, a positive ENSO or a positive SAM and it has an influence on the breeding population, in reality, what does that mean? And just having that link in my mind is I'm still kind of trying to grapple with what that means. I imagine, and you guys explain this in the paper, that it has to do with ocean productivity and the availability of krill. But like, are there simple links that we can make to like help my brain figure out exactly what that means? Eric's laughing.
Yeah.
The idea of somebody asking for a simple link in an oceanographic system that includes covers a third of Earth's surface.
I don't ask for too much.
No, okay, let's deconstruct the Earth down to one word or one syllable word.
Yes.
I thought it was a light discussion.
So basically, if there's positive SAM and that is increasing the breeding success, what positive SAM is resulting in what? That's helping the birds.
Kaz, you want to start talking?
Well, there's a number of different factors, such as like SAM can increase like the productivity of the ocean just through like the increase of wind factors and stuff like that will increase the nutrient upwelling and things like that, as well as also impact on the sea ice, or the sea ice extent will melt, and depending on the timing of the phytoplankton bloom. So then you would expect that along the sea ice edging that there might be more iron and stuff coming into the water due to sea ice melt and things like that, which then would spur up some more nutrients into the water and things like that from that sort of ecosystem. Yeah.
And so one other thing that I noticed as I was looking at your graphs, and I appreciated the way that you put your figures together. You had the northern hemisphere results in one figure and the southern hemisphere in another figure. And just by looking at the graphs, you can see, or at least it seems to me, that the southern hemisphere, the Southern Oscillation Index in particular, seem to have a much stronger impact on, I think it was breeding success, than some of the northern hemisphere ones. And I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about that, because it makes sense to me. But on the other hand, being able to load up with, you know, a bunch of fish and krill prior to coming and migrating back down from also seems to be very important. And so I'm just wondering if you think that is potentially a signal about there just being that they're breeding in the southern hemisphere, and so that's more of a local signal, or is it just too long of a lag time between, you know, when they're leaving the Aleutians and coming back? Is there a reason, basically, do you think there's a real strong reason for the southern hemisphere climate variability having a stronger impact on the birds rather than the northern hemisphere?
Yeah, because they do the dual foraging throughout their breeding season, so they'll take the longer trip down to Antarctica to restore their body condition, and then they'll come back after about 10 to 14 days, and then they'll switch over with their mate pair, and then that pair will go back down to the Southern Ocean and forage, while the other pair is doing shorter foraging trips to the chicks. So then you have that sort of dual foraging happening, so that really in the Southern Ocean is what keeps the adult body weight in, or the adult bird in condition. So what's ever happening in that Southern Hemisphere will be affecting their body weight. Yeah, and then their breeding success, because they need to maintain a certain body condition throughout the breeding season so that they don't leave the nest, or they don't abandon their chick. Eric, did you want to add on to that one?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say that the fun thing the fun and the challenging thing about short-tailed shearwaters is they breed in the southern hemisphere, but they spend 4 or 5 months in the northern hemisphere. They pretty much fly straight through from Southeast Australia up to the North Pacific in around about 2 to 3 weeks, and then they'll spend 5 months up there. They'll try and stock up, body reserves so that when they fly back, because they don't feed in transit between Australia and the North Pacific on the way north, or from North Pacific to Australia on the way south. The paper was trying to disentangle what's happening, what influences were working on the birds, both immediately and with the lags that we built into the models. And so, we could have gone further. One of the things that we've talked about in the past is that given that these birds typically don't start breeding between 4 and 7 years of age, theoretically we could have worked backwards in time up to 7 years to see if there was lag in things such as recruitment into the breeding population as well. We thought we'd keep it simple, just work on a lag of 0 and 1 year, over the 60 years. And the reality is that for such a long time series, we don't actually have very good data going backwards in time either. So, there are obviously constraints in having data set that starts in the 1940s or late 40s, early 50s. So, we were constrained to what we could do. And as Kaz said, basically these birds are breeding in Southeast Australia, and they'll track down. They fly from Southeast Australian breeding colonies down to the Antarctic ice edge in 2 days. 2,000 kilometres in 2 days. They'll spend between 3 to 6, 7-ish days down there, then they'll fly back. So they're working at both ends of the Pacific Ocean, up into the Arctic, all the way down to the Antarctic, and trying to tease apart what factor is driving which parts of the breeding cycle was where we're at with this. And it was just, it's, Kaz has probably got a few more grey hairs than she started when she started her PhD with working up this data set.
So I have another question too. I've got several more questions, don't worry. But I noticed that you guys mentioned that just in the introduction and materials and methods that about the synchrony of egg laying. And it's a very short one. It seems it's only 4 days where that 95% of the eggs are laid between the 24th and 28th of November. Is that still true after all of this time? Like, has there ever been any departure from that based on, climate variability or just based on, local weather conditions? Yeah.
I did a number of field seasons out there, and in 2016 we had a really bumpy year. And so we did the first survey of the island, and then we'll go back and get the mate pair. And during that time, we did find more eggs, and this would have been early December, or the sort of past the 6th. It would have been past the 6th of December, and we were finding new eggs during that time, and it was part of a study that we suggested that needs to be looked at to see if this is still correct, because that was also back to the Cerventi and Irenae time when they were out on the island every year and they were surveying the island quite frequently. But we did notice in 2016, and that was a bumpy year. Like there were so many birds on the island that year.
Yeah, wow, that's really interesting.
Michelle,
yeah, go ahead.
Can I just add, and at the other end of the spectrum, the season that we've just had, the 2019-20 season, the birds were between 2 and 4 weeks late in their return to the colonies. And we're still trying to work out what the hell happened. It was a really weird season. The birds were late. It got quite a bit of media coverage in Australia simply because of the clockwork nature of these birds. And early counts suggested very low occupancy in the burrows, but then when we do our normal onset of incubation counts, we actually had a 50% on average occupancy rate with eggs in burrows. So it was like the birds were able to catch up, even though they had arrived 2 to 4 weeks late, because they normally go down to the Antarctic convergence to feed before they come back to the colonies. And so we're seeing some behavioural plasticity in this species that we're unaware of before this particular season. and we're still, you know, I've got a master's student working on short tails at the moment for this season just gone, and luckily she happened to be working in the season that everything went, you know, completely different. And the breeding success was low, even though the egg laying was, and occupancy at onset of incubation was bang on average. It turns out that the birds made the effort to lay the egg, but then they didn't have the energy reserves to see through to a successful breeding season because of the probable late arrival. But again, we're still unpacking this season's data for another master's thesis.
So do you think then, it sounds like you have both noticed a little bit of a bumpy ride since this data set ended. So this data set ended in 2012. Do you think that there will be, so if you were to look at the last 8 years, do you think that there would be a change between what you saw in the 62-year data set versus, I realize it's only 8 years, but do you think you'd potentially see a change or a difference?
With the data set, we actually have data and it's a continuous ongoing study. But because there was a break in the data set of 2 years, the reviewer asked us to remove the data further on from that. And having that in the analysis didn't actually change. So we were still seeing the same trends over time that we did without removing that. But just from being on the island from year to year, just seeing the changes. And one of the other things which is highly synchronized is they're switching over. So when they go down to Antarctica and come back, within about 3 days, all the birds have switched over on the island. But what we noticed in the poor years is that that wasn't happening as often either. So you could usually go out and monitor the island, and if you noticed the birds starting to change, then you'd survey. But in a poorer year, I guess, when there wasn't many birds around, it wasn't as synchronized, and it was a bit hit and miss in those poorer years. Yeah.
Fascinating. That's fascinating. So my next question has to do with the study site itself, and it. So Fisher Island is one of seemingly many places. I learned a lot about short-tailed shearwaters recently after reading this, or because of reading this. And so, to my knowledge, if I'm correct, there's millions and millions of short-tailed shearwaters. Yes, is that right? And so I'm wondering what signals can we use from Fisher Island to say, okay, is the species in general doing okay, or do you think it's too localized to be able to make those kind of inferences?
Probably is a little localized, because the second paper that I'm working on at the moment is looking at the other harvested islands in the area. So the short-tailed shearwater is also harvested as a chick by the Aboriginal community for commercial purposes, and also recreationally harvest. So just looking at those islands, there is quite, they produce the same sort of signal throughout the breeding season, but compared to Fisher Island in the short period of time, it's slightly different. And there's another paper by Hunter and Caswell, I think it's a New Zealand paper, where they looked at the selectivity of the short-tailed shearwater and harvest and what that sort of meant. So that would probably answer a few more of those questions.
Interesting. Eric, do you have anything to add?
Oh, just going on with what Kaz is saying. The species is found from probably about I'm just trying to work out off the top of my head, probably about a 3-degree latitude, range in colonies. And so there are latitudinal climbs in breeding behavior, breeding performance, and things like that. So the good thing about Kaz's work is it's done on the longest time series for the species. So that's obviously why it did it.
Yep.
But it's fortuitous that it's actually pretty much smack bang in the middle of the latitudinal range for the species, and certainly in the geographic area that's probably got the greatest concentration. Some of the islands in the Fernal Islands, you're talking about millions of burrows, and essentially, entire islands are just riddled with burrows. So in that sense, I guess Kaz is right in saying that we're seeing intra-island and inter-island differences in the different parameters. So you've always got to be careful when you extrapolate from any data set to any other data set. It doesn't matter how good or bad you think it is. So no, Kaz was spot on with the we're getting a signal how representative it is. Let's put together another 60-year data set on another island, then
somewhere else. Right. And I think for now, I'll probably come up with more questions, but the first thing I thought of when I started reading this about the birds being banded and having the mark recapture studies was survival, right? And I realized that you guys didn't do this, but at the end of the paper, it says that that's something that will potentially be looked at in the future. And I'm just wondering what your hypotheses may be about whether climate variability is going to impact survival and recruitment, and or whether or not addressing that is possible.
So whether or not it's possible is the $99 million question. So I spent, because of the time series is so long, I spent a number of weeks in Montpellier with Roger Padel, working on some mark recapture, and we couldn't get the model to go because of the error and the percentage. Got to try. I'm not very good at explaining, but it's to do with the resites. So because each year, often a bird would be resited, because there's low recruitment into the islands, like there's only 50% recruitment in, and then the time series being so long, we were getting big errors and the model wouldn't run. So then we tried splitting the data set into two, so 30 years and 30 years, and then trying to merge it together, but it just kind of wasn't happening in our PhD times. So your PhD time's ticking away. So we had to just put that on the back burner, but that's hopefully something that they'll revisit, and maybe not using eSurge. Maybe they'll start looking at using a different program for that as well. But you should get some really good, if you can, like even if you split it into the 30 years, you might be able to get some really good signals coming through, like Remy did in one of his albatross papers, and they looked at survival, and the survival was different in adults versus juveniles as well. So hopefully you could get something like that happening.
In males versus females, they said as well, right? There was differences. Yeah, right.
In sexes as well. So yeah, we did start off with my whole PhD was supposed to be, learning eSurge and going down that track with this data set, but it just wasn't happening with eSurge. So we took a little bit of a different, we changed direction a bit with the papers and the chapters.
I think everyone on this call probably recognizes that, relates to that. You thought you knew what you were going to do, and then you do something different entirely sometimes.
We all have that in common.
Yeah.
And eSurge is hard. Like, you need to be a math wizard for that one.
Yeah.
You really need to be.
Michelle, just to answer a sub-question or an embedded thread in your question, at the moment, the oldest known short-tailed shearwater is 48 years old and still breeding.
Wow, that was definitely an interesting thing to know for sure. 48 years, wow.
Yeah.
Well,
and,
I mean, you think
the
Fisher Island database, that's 48 years old as well.
Yeah. So.
Wow.
There'll be older ones out there.
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, no, that's the oldest known bird, and as Grant said, almost certainly there's going to be other birds out there they're going to be older than the ones that have been banded and studied. So yeah, just
wow,
as a comment.
That's incredible. And the number of, or the amount of emigration, or I guess dispersal away from the natal nest is fairly low as well, right?
Yeah.
Did I read that correctly? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
At the
So they
islands close by, and there wasn't that much. Yeah.
That's amazing. So the last thing I'll say, and then I think is it probably time to open it up for other questions. So Cass, if you were going to describe your study to me, and I was say 10 years old, what would you want me to know, and what would be like the things you would hope I would be curious about for your study?
I would be curious about, well, within the study, really like the large scale impact of what climate can do on the productivity through the ocean. So just like the building blocks of life and what that actually means to higher trophic species. That's probably the thing that drew me most to the project and wanting to do that sort of thing. So that would be what would be, the most sort of interesting part. And just, I guess that would be it.
Having that connection between the ocean and the higher trophic levels.
Yeah. Yep.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I will stop talking now and open it up for questions. Does anyone else have questions?
Yeah, we got a few questions out there. I think Lauren Roman had a question. Lauren, I'm gonna unmute you if you want to ask your question. There you go. You're unmuted.
Hey Eric. Hey Cass.
Hi, Lauren.
Miles
How's
away. And put the video on just temporarily. I don't have much bandwidth. There we go.
How are you?
Yeah, good. Cold.
Yeah.
So I was going to ask, great study by the way. I'll admit that unfortunately I have not read it yet. It is on my enormous pile of things to do, which it gets grows every day rather than gets smaller every day. I was going to ask, in your climate variability modelling, did you find anything interesting on those big wreck years that might be happening probably more likely in the Northern Hemisphere? So like 2013, 2011, the years where there's been mass mortalities on the Australian coast?
Not overly, but we did touch on that in a separate paper with Alan Springer. We started looking at the salmon and how that, that paper. Looking at some things like that, but we haven't used that for this paper. We haven't looked at those sorts of trends with this one, but that might be something interesting to look at to see if that coincides.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the other paper. I've got some reservations, but it could be interesting. But I think it would be interesting to see what climate effects have. I've been running through a lot of my rec data recently, just looking at other things, not climate, but I am only because I haven't got time to do climate yet. But I think by the time the birds wreck, they're probably already in pretty shocking shape, which makes me suspect that whatever's going on in those years is happening in the north rather than in the south.
I think it'll probably be a little bit of both, because over in the north, and then when they come over, if there's enough food resources here, you'd expect that then they'd be able to rebuild their body condition and stuff like that as well. So I think it would have dual. And I think in 2014, it was a bit of where we were missing in Fisher data, but not the other Furneaux Island data. There was a really low number of breeding success. And I think Grant had this in one of his papers. And in that year, I think he touched on there was like some anomalies happening over outside of the world as well. And that coincided with some wrecks that year.
So that's what I'm, because that was that year that millions of them probably died.
There was
hundreds on the beach where I was.
So unfortunately, that was one of the years that we were missing Fisher data for.
Oh, what a pain.
It was.
Always.
But Grant, you might be able to add something on that with your study of the sooties.
Yeah, well, it's actually funny because that was that year of the big crash was the year I was tagging shearwaters on codfish. And that was the same year that I lost every single one of my tags.
Oh, no.
Sounds about right.
Yeah, it was because the year was so poor. Either the birds didn't return, or the ones that did return were in such poor condition that it wasn't worth disturbing them anymore.
Wait, so that was 2013-14 sooty shearwaters, did you say?
Oh yeah.
Okay, so it affected sooties as well. Which ocean was that in?
So that was this was New Zealand, right? So I did my PhD with cities, as Eric will be fully aware.
And there's a good paper as well by Maud, I think, as well, and she shows in the same year at Garbo and Griffith that there were massive drops in that year.
Yeah, I know not only the number of breeders is extremely low, but Nat Bulls said that the breeding weight, so those that did breed were skinny that year as well. Yeah, so it's interesting that it's multi-species.
Yeah, we had,
Cool.
that's in the second paper, we see that, the big drop in the body weight in that as well.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that one when that paper's published.
Yeah.
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 All right. Thanks.
Hopefully not long.
I think
Hopefully.
we'll try and get on to the next question. Thanks, Lauren. That was great. John's got a question here. I'm going to unmute you, John. I just noticed you were taking us for a ride. You must be on the phone at the moment. I was spinning in circles for a minute there.
I've not got a great connection here, and I've got one child playing the piano and the other one playing audio books at full volume. So yeah, it's a bit hectic. Thanks very much for the paper, guys. That's really interesting, and it's fantastic to see the Fisher Island data getting used and being published. That's super exciting to see. I was looking at the fluctuation in the breeding numbers, and there's a kind of down and up large scale trend, but there's also year-to-year fluctuations. Are those driven by birds skipping breeding, do we think? And I'm interested in what a huge distance migrant like the shearwater does if it's skipping breeding. Does it come back and hang around, or is it staying way out in the ocean? And maybe even this is a question for the Manx shearwater guys as well.
Yeah. I think some of them, I think in Nat's paper, isn't it, Eric, that they actually go down and they hang out down south in Antarctica, possibly? Eric, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we've got very limited information. There hasn't been a lot of stuff published yet. There's a couple of studies that have looked at satellite tracking the birds throughout a 12-month period. And we've got some evidence to suggest that the birds actually fly past the colonies on their way back from the Northern Hemisphere and go down to the Antarctic convergence and feed up down there before they return to the colonies and reoccupy burrows and re-establish pair bonds. The non-breeders are a little bit harder to get our hands on, obviously, because they're just not spending time at the colonies to have packages attached to them. But certainly there is a suggestion that the birds will come back from the Northern Hemisphere. So there's almost a complete removal of the birds from the North Pacific, and they all fly back to Southeast Australia. And then they seem to make the decision, however you want to put quotes around those words, to breed after their arrival here. So whether they, and this is touching on what Lauren was talking about as well, whether the birds arrive with sufficient body reserves to kickstart a breeding season, or whether they decide that their reserves are such that they don't have the capacity to breed. And as I said, this year we saw late arrivals, we saw 50% occupancy rate, but then low breeding success. So there's a whole raft of periods along the way where the breeding success can fall over based on energy reserves for the individuals. So John, I don't know if that's your question or not.
It does to an extent, but do you see non-breeding birds in burrows or on the surface at night, or do we think that they're mostly like out and about?
Well, Kaz has spent more time on the colony than I haven't actually been in that particular colony, but certainly you do see non-breeding birds, attending perhaps more so early in the season rather than once eggs have laid and chicks have hatched. Kaz?
Or what was that, Eric?
Oh, about the non-breeding birds attending the colonies during the season.
Yeah, you don't really find that many, and if they are, they're usually on the surface, like they're just surface birds, so they're not actually in the burrows. That's what we found, and that's what Irene had said in his papers as well.
Yeah, and it may just be that those are basically voyeurs watching and learning social cues and behavioural cues and vocal cues for when they do join the breeding population.
Very cool. Thanks for that question, John. All right, I think it's about time we moved on to the next paper. So Cass, Eric, thanks for joining us today. Really cool paper. Of course, you guys probably know that shearwaters are near and dear to my heart. So thank you very much for publishing this. Your data was much nicer than mine.
And thanks for your work as well, because that really helped with mine. So
I'm glad that something I did was inspiring.
yeah, it was. I've got your thesis there.
You can burn it. Burn it.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Michelle, thanks for introducing that paper. And please stay on the line, folks. We're on the next paper now. We've got David is going to introduce the next one. We've got Joe. Here you are, and Tim is here. Hello, Tim. Nice to see you again. You can tell that we've been doing this long enough now that we're starting to recycle co-authors. All right, I think with that, David, we can kick you off.
Yes, excellent. And thanks a lot to Joe and Tim for joining. So the Oxford Navigation Group seems to be kicking out one big paper after the other, hence the second invitation. And thanks for joining at such short notice and getting up early and then waiting for a while. So the paper we discuss is on the natal imprinting to the Earth's magnetic field in a pelagic seabird. And the story is that as young seabirds fledge, they leave their natal colonies behind and migrate to faraway places of the world's ocean. To reach these places, they use a clock and compass system they inherited from their parents. This provides them with approximate guidance on where to migrate to. The rest is a lot of learning by doing. For instance, if you track shearwater fledglings, they use much wider migratory corridors than experienced adults. The adults along the same route are like on a highway, and juveniles wiggle around a lot in their movements. So movements along these maiden journeys are now fairly well known, but the big question is, how do immature seabirds find their way back to their natal colony after spending sometimes years at sea? They can use memories of oceanic landscapes gathered as they roamed around after leaving the nest, but what clues they actually use remains mysterious. In this context, people speculated that young birds may use characteristics of the Earth's magnetic field at the natal colony as a clue upon its latitude. And that's the hypothesis the authors tested. And I forgot to mention, this is a collaboration between Oxford and Oldenburg University. So they tested this hypothesis in Manx shearwaters from the UK. And they're the species, in this species, the juveniles leave the natal colonies to move to the South Atlantic, where they stay. And they really like the Patagonian shelf there. And they only come back to breed in the UK after 3 years at sea. We know this precisely because some of them have been tracked with geolocators. And as you know, in the UK, there's a lot of birds ringing or bending, and Manx shearwaters are not an exception. And since the 1950s, about 3,000 shearwater fledglings, which had been ringed, came back to breed. The vast majority settled at natal colonies, but about 4% dispersed to other colonies. In the 3 years during which young shearwaters were away from home, there were small changes in the Earth's magnetic field, being its inclination or intensity. And the authors had the idea that these small changes could misguide the returning birds, leading them to disperse to other colonies, either to the north or to the south of the natal colony. And in a fascinating manner, the data suggest they could be right. So the 4% I mentioned correspond to about 100 birds which dispersed to non-natal colonies. And the latitude of these new colonies was linked to changes in the inclination of the Earth's magnetic field. So if you want to figure this, it's a bit like a bird riding a magnetic wave and being pushed either a bit too far north or left to land a bit south of its target. Of course, the authors, and they'll tell us more about the analysis, are very careful about these correlative findings. Notably, they admit that the mechanism they identified only provides approximate position and a clue on latitude, and they stress that other seascape cues and social constraints also determine colony choice. I really like the bit of the discussion where they state that, and I quote, "The role of the Earth's magnetic field in avian navigation has had a controversial history." That's a very polite way to depict a mud fight. And interestingly, if you do a word search on the PDF in the manuscript, you never find the word olfaction, even though you find it in one of the quoted references. So well done on this study, really, really nice stuff. And the question I was asking myself all the way through reading is, how on earth did you come up with that hypothesis? Did someone notice a trend in existing data, or was the kickoff of the study and the analysis purely theoretical?
It's really similar to a study done by Ken Lohman's group and some studies by Nathan Putman, which were done in sea turtles and salmonids respectively. So essentially they use sort of long-term data sets gathered on where these animals are going. So I'll take one example, which is Nathan Putman's study of sockeye salmon. And essentially they've got this big island that blocks the way into an estuary with a pass to the north and a pass to the south. And essentially what they find is that changes in the intensity of the Earth's magnetic field force as the field moves north, the more birds go through the northern passage. And as the field moves south, and more birds go, more salmon go through the southern passage.
So in that case, the clue was intensity and not the inclination.
Yes, that's right.
Do you have any idea why in your study system it was inclination rather than intensity?
I guess it's the only thing that sort of most of the authors agree on in the magnetoreception literature is that birds are sensitive to inclination. And so the reason we tested both was that we thought inclination was much more likely to form a cue. It could be that birds are not sensitive to intensity, or it could be that it's not as useful a cue when it comes to latitudinal position, because it doesn't vary as nicely with the lines of latitude.
Yeah. And to continue about latitude, as you state in the paper, so the inclination is mainly a cue on latitude, and in your study system you have maybe the luck of the British Isles being lined up north-south, as well as the colonies along most of the coastlines. What would happen if the UK was spread like this, and the birds would have to locate the colonies according to their longitude?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the inclination would not be fantastically useful in that kind of context. You'd think they need to extract some sort of longitudinal cue. What that would be if you're talking Earth's magnetic field, there's some studies in reed warblers, which postulate that you can use declination, which is essentially the difference between where the magnetic North Pole is and where the true North Pole is. That forms an angle that varies fairly systematically with longitude, although declination moves around a lot and perhaps might not be the best cue for very long distance navigation, especially if you're letting 3 years pass between when you're leaving the colony and coming back. So you might expect that magnetoreception is not fantastically helpful in that situation.
And you mentioned also that the situation might be challenging for juvenile and immature shearwaters because they cross the equator, and so they're faced with a mirror image on the southern hemisphere. Any idea how they navigate when crossing the equator back towards the northern hemisphere?
Yeah, so in short, no, I don't think we really have any way of sort of getting at that from the study route at hand. Certainly not what we put in that manuscript. I guess equator crossing is quite complicated for a lot of proposed compass systems and a couple of the proposed map systems like this inclination-based sort of measure of latitude. I guess it could be that you could follow relatively simple rules, like essentially once you hit the 0 line, reverse the direction you're going towards, or if you're just using the inclination as a signpost, i.e. like I'm going to travel north, and when I hit this value, I'm going to stop. Then actually, because of where the birds winter, then whilst the relationship wouldn't be linear, the inclination would decrease to 0, and then it would start increasing again as you go into the northern hemisphere. If you were waiting for the value to hit 52 or 60 or whatever, then that would work fine, I think.
Yeah, excellent. No, fascinating stuff. Yeah, sorry, Tim.
Can I add I just wanted to add a short comment because perhaps some people don't know the evidence on passerines, but there is some evidence that garden warblers switch their response to the inclination of the field as a compass when they're placed in a horizontal magnetic field, and that suggests then that at least some birds have a mechanism for reversing their response to the inclination compass. So it's feasible that might be the way that the problem of getting across the equator is solved. But the problem, as Joe has said, is true whichever compass system you're using. When you get to the equator, you have to do something different on the other side, whether that's a solar compass or a magnetic compass.
And I'm curious, so what did Chris Perrins think of the study? Did he say, oh, I knew it for a while?
I won't put words into Chris's mouth, but Chris is usually present at all of our discussion group meetings, and usually an hour into these, he says, yes, back in the 1960s, I've got some data, then he'll rummage in his briefcase and bring out some data which are pertinent to the question, which he gathered 50 years ago. No, I think he's enjoying it. This is, as you pointed out earlier, David, a slightly unusual departure for us. Most of the studies that we have done on seabird navigation in general, where we've included magnetic treatments, have had no effect. And so this is a slightly unusual finding for us to see an effect of the magnetic fields. Not a manipulation, as you pointed out, but in most of the studies we've been looking at much shorter distance navigation, and there olfactory manipulation seemed to be much more important.
Yeah, and the reason for my very first question was that what you find is probably a fairly subtle effect that no one would have noticed without the really advanced analysis you performed. Yeah. So it's probably not obvious in the field, right?
Well, I suspect that's right. And again, as with the previous paper that you talked about, we benefit from a long-term data set, which we didn't gather, but a long-term data set which allows you to pull out signal from processes which are fundamentally noisy. But I will say I had nothing to do with the analysis. Joe did this analysis, and he's got some others up his sleeve as well, which I expect you'll hear about in the future.
Yeah, okay. Well, thanks a lot for the insights, and also for joining at short notice and getting up early this morning. Thanks a lot. It was really nice to have this paper and talk about it. Grant, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I actually got this paper from Chris Tyson a little while ago. I think Chris has worked with you before in the past, Joe.
Yeah.
And he says hi, by the way. But yeah, I mean, I was curious about, and maybe I missed this in the paper, but what's the impact of a shifting geomagnetic north pole? And is that something that you picked up in your analysis at all, or dealt with in your analysis, or do you think that there will be an appreciable impact?
Yeah, so I guess like simply to take a slight step back, hopefully to take a larger step forward. Essentially, the Earth's magnetic field you can kind of think of as a vector that exists within 3 dimensions, and obviously the dimension that we're interested in is the X and Y because that tells us which way our polarity compass goes. And so, but what's kind of interesting is that we think birds aren't sensitive to this at all. And so they determine which way is north by the inclination of the field, which is essentially this vector in 3 dimensions will point towards the surface of the Earth or away from it, and that will tell you which way is poleward and which way is equatorward. So as the Earth's magnetic pole sort of moves away from or towards the geomagnetic, towards true north, then this will affect the declination of the field, but probably won't have a huge impact on the inclination of the field at a specific latitude. And so as the pole moves around, then this will cause the declination angle, the difference between true north and magnetic north at a specific location, that will change quite a lot. And actually, we've done some analyses subsequent to this, looking at declination, and the thing that struck me is that it is a huge effect between years. Whereas actually inclination probably wouldn't be affected by this too much. I think, I don't know, but I would even imagine that if the poles flipped, which I think they want to do every couple of thousand years, then this wouldn't have a huge impact on inclination because you just would get because the birds aren't sensitive to the polarity of the inclination, then they just get the southern value.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, that's kind of an interesting thought too. What happens if the poles suddenly flip? Of course, if you read anything in the media, it's all about how geese are going to be flying north for the winter and south for their. Yeah. So, anyways, that's quite cool. Michelle, do you have any particular questions that you wanted to throw at Joe?
I have it's more about navigation in general, if that's okay. So it's not specific to this, but I'm just like an overarching kind of general question about your thoughts on something else. What are your thoughts on whether animals navigate by using the gravitational pull or in addition to, or instead of magnetic pull?
To be honest, I've not given it a fantastic amount of thought. To me,
yeah, I don't know. Like, I feel like that's not a very mainstream thought, but there's some folks that I've talked to recently who are kind of going down that line, and so I don't know enough about it. So I'm just curious if you guys have thoughts on that.
I guess in seabirds, I've not really seen anything, but yeah. So sorry, Tim, do you
want to go? No, this is a hypothesis that's sort of come and gone over the decades in the homing pigeon literature, and I think the consensus would be that for pigeon navigation, which is probably the best studied of any avian navigation, there is no solid evidence for a role for the Earth's magnetic field. Excuse me, for the gravity. That was a dangerous slip there, wasn't it?
Gonna say there's your paper out the window.
That's gravitational. I am aware of a couple of studies, but they're heavily confounded with other factors, I think. So, and this sort of lack of repeatability is quite a common feature of the slightly out there hypotheses in pigeon navigation. I think the best summary of all the work is probably Hans Wallraff's 2005 book on avian navigation, in which he does treat this subject slightly. But you have to ask the question: what is trying to be answered with reference to some of these hypotheses, gravity in particular? What is the problem that you're trying to answer?
Yeah, I think so the ones that I'm thinking of are it's multi-species, so it's not just birds. But the ones that I'm thinking of were more along the lines of figuring out specific, so more fine scale navigational routes. And I've just seen the evidence. This one happened to be in Wales, but I know they've shown it or suggested, I believe, in other seabirds, but I don't remember which species. And again, it's, I think, kind of the sample size is relatively low. But anyway, seeing that a whale was kind of traveling along, and then as the moon moved, it kind of got lost. And then as the moon came back around, it apparently found its path again. Again, I don't know very much about it, but I was just curious if that's what you all think about that. So I don't know what the questions are, actually, to answer your question. I don't know exactly what it is, but I think it's a matter of like how are these animals finding their way from point A to point B in the open ocean where there's very little to see and things like that. And so the question was, is it magnetic? Is it gravitational? Is there some other signal? And a little bit of evidence, I guess, for gravity.
Yeah, if I can come back again, sorry, Joe. I think that, I mean, what you're illustrating is that there are extraordinary phenomena out there which we really still don't understand, and oceanic navigation is one of them. And it's an absolutely fascinating and wide open subject. The idea that, and also your comment about the involvement of the moon is a sort of lovely one, because in a sense it illustrates the warning signals that one has to have going off in your head all the time when you're doing the sort of work that Joe's been doing actually with these correlative studies. There's no doubt that animals are sensitive to the moon, but of course the moon has all sorts of effects on the Earth, not just the change in the gravity that animals might sense. So all intertidal animals are sensitive to the moon, but probably not through the effects directly of gravity. And so disentangling those kinds of things is a really tough thing to do, as is trying to do an experiment with the moon. But so some of these things may stay as mysteries for a very long time.
Yeah, you put a big blanket over it, I'm sure. Very good. Okay, do we have any questions from the audience? I don't see any burning at the moment, but if anyone does, please raise your hand or type it down in the Zoom chat. Yeah, David, do you have any other follow-up questions while we're waiting for somebody to? Nope.
No, not. But I'd really like to thank the authors again for joining, and it was a pleasure reading their paper and discussing the matter. Really, really nice stuff. Yeah,
it's quite cool. These sorts of papers on navigation are quite interesting because, like you said, Tim, it's still such a mystery as to what's really driving this. It could be, I mean, there's obviously the magnetic side, the olfaction side, and a lot of it could be these cumulative effects. Whether or not it's a combination of the moon, olfaction and magnetics, that depending on the spatial scales you're looking at.
Yeah.
Mary Claire might have a question. She says she may have a question. I'm not sure if that means you do have a question or you may have a question. So I'll unmute you and let you clarify.
Okay, I think I do then. So now I'm unmuted. Morning, Joe and Tim. Hi, happy to see you again.
Mary Claire, hi.
So I was wondering, I will admit I still have to read the paper properly, so I hope I'm not asking a stupid question. But from the birds that were then found in colonies that were not their native colony, were there more females than males? Because the general idea is that females are more likely to disperse from a colony than males are. Was this the case in the 90s or not?
Yes, I think so. We didn't look into this in the analysis, and I don't think we can tell from the data that we've got because they're not. You can't sex them as juveniles. Ones that were caught as breeders in subsequent years, if they were caught at the right time of year, you could imagine that they could be sexed by cloacal bruising. But I think the vast majority of the birds have a big NA in the column for sex, which is a bit unfortunate, because you're right, like if there was a mechanism of dispersal, you might expect one sex to stay constant and the other one to move.
Yeah, I wonder if it is the case that it is more likely that females, well, yeah, I wonder what the mechanism would be then to have this sex difference, if it's rather than apart from these budging up with the magnetic field, whether females are just then overall more relaxed to it and males try to copy it. All right, cool. I look forward to reading it properly.
Thank you.
Come on now. Thanks, Mary Claire. Nice to see you. All right.
Mary Claire's comment has just made me think of a prospect for the future, which is that once DNA sexing becomes sufficiently easy that citizens can do it in the field as they're putting the ring on, you could easily add the sex to the ring number in normal ringing operations. Of course, people try to do that in birds that are easily sexed, but you could potentially do that for birds which are not easily sexed, morphologically. Anyway, something for the future ringers of the world.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah. Can you imagine a little stick like a pregnancy test or something, and you just put a drop of blood on it and you get a sex?
Mm-hmm.
All right. I think with that, we'll close it off. It's 20 to 9 my time. I'm sure some of you want to get on with your evenings and days. Thanks, Tim and Joe, for joining us. Really cool paper. I certainly enjoyed reading it. That was it's an interesting insight into magnetics. So thanks for that. And David, of course, thanks for introducing that. Michelle, thank you so much for joining us today and introducing that first paper. It was lovely to see you and catch up, of course, and we'll hopefully catch up again sometime soon. And with that, I think we'll say goodbye. So stay safe, everyone. Stay inside, masks on, all that sort of stuff. And we'll see you again next week. We'll be on at 1600 GMT. So next week, we've got Juita Martinez, who's joining us. She's one of the co-founders.
Oh, good.
Yeah, so she's one of the co-founders of the Black Birders Week. So she's should be quite an
Pelican specialist.
Yeah, she's a self-described lover of floof. So
that's great.
It should be a good one next week as well. All right, thanks everyone, and take care. Have a good evening, or good day.
Thanks so much.
Afternoon.
Thanks a lot.
Bye everyone.
Bye bye.